Welcome back to the OPEX podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Dan Pardi from humanOS. On today's episode, Dan and I discuss all things longevity. Guys, this was a great conversation with Dan. Hope you enjoyed. Stick around. Dan Pardi, you absolute beauty. Thank you so much for making time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's so nice to be here. Robbie, thank you for having me on. Staying patient with me as we had to do some rescheduling a few times, but you're a gem.
Man, when you're out there changing the world, it's understandable.
Yeah, there's just, I hate to do it because I really respect people's time. And, me asking you to adjust your schedule for mine feels a bit like a selfish act, so I don't do it casually. But there were a few things that I needed to attend to that, and I appreciate your understanding.
Listen, man, you're well worth the wait. So, Dan, I really want to get you on to speak about longevity. That's our topic. So we got about 45 minutes max here, maybe a little bit less. And I know it's an area that you are very passionate about. You look at it from multiple angles. I know originally how I came across you, was your work when it came to sleep and circadian biology, but I know you've gone down some other rabbit holes as well. I know you're very big on human behavioral change. So basically, this whole conversation is going to revolve around health and longevity. And of course, it can go anywhere it wants. But in terms of health and longevity, when I say health and longevity to you and ask you, Dan, how would you currently go about maximizing someone's health and longevity? What would your answer be to that?
Live as naturally as possible.
We're done.
Thank you, everybody.
Just a mic drop and walk off.
Yeah. Let's not complicate it. So I'm, it's interesting. People have gotten to know some of my work, a lot of through sleep. I was early in the sleep field relative to people speaking about it on podcasts. And it's been an honor to be able to both take the time, learn about it more, and then share that information because it's valuable. And it's increasingly valuable as our society and our technology makes good sleep harder to get. So the needs are matching with the interest. So that's been fun, but it certainly doesn't end there for me in terms of my interests. I'm interested in anything that makes the human body work well. And that's, of course, the standard categories of diet and exercise. Now, sleep is a fundamental one that is included in most people's perspective, and other stressors as well: temperature, light, friendships, and those sorts of perspectives. All of these things do matter. But I'm also very much interested in aging, and in a way, when we're thinking about health, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. You can look at it as a binary state of, well, I'm healthy because I'm not sick. And that is how many people do look at that. It's sort of a societal delusion, as I call it. And I don't think that it's true. It's not true. But rather, we know that health is really a spectrum or a continuum. And if you ingest the full definition of what health really is, it's not just our resilience to stressors of the body to maintain that balance, internal balance, but it's also the fuel for realizing our aspirations and our goals. There's a strong performance element to health, and fully acknowledging that is probably one of the best ways to maintain health over the lifespan, because what are your triggers to focus on health if you're not sick? And I think that then comes back to, well, then how do I just make my day really good? And by the way, one of the best ways to then live well and to maximize longevity, at least in terms of what we know now, is to do things on a regular basis, not on a periodic basis, and not occasional challenges that get you focused and then you go back to a pattern that's less than optimal. So the more that we can interweave a healthy, natural pattern of living into the actual fabric of today's life, which includes technology usage and lights in our home and convenient foods, the better chances we stand at being able to have health fuel a life that helps us, reach our goals and aspirations and have enough energy for kids and family and friends and hobbies and all that good stuff. So, yeah, I mean, when we think of aging, in a lot of ways, we think that we see with clear eyes the age related loss of function that then can lead to chronic diseases of all sorts, which are truly symptoms of a failing physiology that did not start overnight, but can sometimes take many decades to finally reach what we call a clinical horizon, where you now have the diagnostic criteria in front of you that say you indeed do have diabetes or Alzheimer's or depression. But more often than not, like I said, it didn't start a week ago. And, as there's now a greater focus on this, there's a lot of interest into the different factors that are behind the symptoms: mitochondrial health, inflammation, senescent cells, et cetera, proteostasis balance, maintenance of proteostasis, which is protein balance, clearing out dead cells, genomic integrity, and epigenetic regulation. So what I like, and even though we're still very early in this field, I would say, especially when you look at it from a funding perspective, that places like the Buck Institute, which is nearby me in Marin, which is one of the centers of excellence of aging research in the world, the first biomedical institute solely dedicated to aging. They've been around for 30 years. They just had their 30-year anniversary this last year. And they are making really excellent strides at understanding these core mechanisms that are happening really oftentimes throughout the body, maybe not in a completely uniform way. But if you have, for example, diabetes, it doesn't mean your risk for a lot of other different conditions escalates. And that is because the body is then failing in multiple ways. And the symptoms that appear first or second might be, first diabetes, but then Alzheimer's disease. And so we still have sort of this symptom first approach to looking at our health. And the movement in aging is now looking at more of what is the background biology that's taking place that then leads to these very symptoms of aging. Can we address those directly? And that's sort of an introduction to health and aging, and sort of the movement that has gotten a lot of people very excited today. So I have my opinions that are continuing to form. I have a saying that we should have strong opinions held loosely, which means know a subject well enough so that you have clarity on where you stand today, but then don't be stubborn to upgrade your knowledge in the face of new information. And I love that. It's sort of like, I'm going to take the time to learn it, but I'm not going to be stubborn and not modify it, because things are changing all the time. And that's sort of, I'm always working in that space. And it's kind of interesting because when we're dealing with a lot of change, because there's a lot of effort and momentum in the space, you sort of have to upgrade your playbook regularly. But that's kind of fun if it's not too daunting.
So, like, kind of where I'm here at the moment now is just thinking to myself there is that, you're probably getting a lot of listeners to this podcast, who would be well aware, like, I understand, right, that sleep is important, exercise is important, stress management is important, relationships is important. These areas are critical to if my goal is health and longevity, and to live to a ripe old age. And I was kind of listening to Peter Attia there on Dan Harris's podcast, and he was kind of saying that he was talking about, like, the way we'd like to go about is we just like to stay healthy, and at the end, boom, just a nice quick drop off,
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of, instead of having like 100 quality years and a quick drop off, than saying having 75 good years and the last 25 you're really just kind of a zombie on drugs or whatever. But
Mm-hmm.
sorry, where I'm getting at here is, and I'm rambling like I always do, is that I think for the listeners here, like, getting into like, oh well, tell us, what should I do for sleep, and the usual thing, oh, cold dark room. I think most people who listen to this would know that they understand of maybe like how to set up a good sleep environment, and they understand good exercise habits, and again they can appreciate that having good social relationships and good stress management and maybe a meditative practice are all important. I think what would be best for people to get something from this conversation is, one, maybe speak about some of the underlying mechanisms that are interesting to you, of like what happens in sleep. So the sleep and DNA repairs was super interesting to me. I think that'd be interesting to some of the listeners. Then also, if we have a bit of time, maybe start speaking to you about sunlight that we just spoke about offline before we got into our conversation, because I know you found that super interesting with your interview with Scott Byrne, which I'll link in the show notes. And then just if we do get time, and if not, we can schedule this for 2022, and I can get you again. But behavioral change, Dan, like, and that's your big thing too, is like, listen, I understand about sleep. I know how to set up a sleep environment, or I understand about blue light at night, and I understand about, say nutritionally, and I understand I shouldn't be exercising too much or too little. But then it's these habits we have that we build up as mechanisms, I think, to cope with uncertainty in our life. It's better to know the devil you know than not know, uncertainty. Like, so certain people stick to self-inflicted, self-limiting behaviors because they're comfortable. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I don't want to make a change because it's unknown if I make a change, and it just gets back to that uncertainty and people getting comfortable and just habit change. So 3 things there mainly. I think some of the mechanisms you find interesting when it comes to areas like sleep, nutrition, social relationships, stress management, meditation, if there's anything that's coming to mind. I found the sleep and DNA in your podcast interview with Laurie very fascinating. And then I think if we can get sunlight in, that would be great. And if that's as much we get in, that's fantastic. But if you can finish offering with behavioral change, I think that
Yeah.
would be fantastic for the listeners. So again, the floor is all yours until the end, my man.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that to the listeners who are doing a lot of those things that you listed well, congratulations.
Yeah.
That's not an insignificant thing, even though it can sometimes be simple or mundane, as I say. In fact, I think a lot of things that make us healthy are what I call the mundane but meaningful. They don't show well on Instagram, but they're super important.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. Now, the other thing is that it's hard to continue. I'm sort of doing this in reverse, by the way, Robbie, so apologize. I'm talking a little bit about behavior,
No
and I'll
problem.
probably move a little into we might go back and forth here, but doing things continuously is challenging if you don't know why you're doing it. And so the reason for learning, and it's why I'm motivated to teach people and learn myself, but to then ultimately teach folks about these things that matter, is to give people a deeper understanding of why they're doing something. And I don't think that belief is a binary concept, right? You can believe something to be true, but then if I were to teach you more details about that, your belief might deepen to a point of action. Where before it was like, yeah, I think that's probably right, but I don't know it necessarily well enough to allow it to trigger the motivation necessary to continue with it or to stick with it. And that we see all the time. So I can go and speak to a corporate office about the benefits of exercise, and I guarantee you that there's probably not a single person in the room that doesn't believe that exercise is valuable to them before I even said the first word. So why come? Because there's still value to be had by deepening your understanding around these things. Now, then the question becomes, should you seek to become a college professor at all of these subjects that do matter? I don't think so. Now, that doesn't mean that you do not have the right to then pursue it to the peak of your interests. You can, but if you feel daunted that you have to have 15 PhDs across all the different subjects of health, that's not necessary. In fact, you can do all the behaviors without knowing, and you will get all the benefits, as though you were the PhD. And conversely, you could have a PhD on all these different subjects, and it doesn't vaccinate you from doing the things that information directs you to do. So we're really ultimately talking about behavior change when we talk about all of this science. And that, I think, is a really nice way to conceptualize this, is that I am the director of my life. My health, to a large part, is my responsibility. I can have a really effective care team, like doctors, et cetera, and the better they are, that's great, because then I've got good people on my team. But it's my responsibility to adjust my lighting in the day. It's my responsibility to go to bed and not watch one more episode of Netflix or whatever. All right, there's all these things that I need to self-direct. And so the pursuit of mastery over your own health is not only wise, but it's increasingly needed as our environment changes. And we have to act, as I say, a little strange in order to then create different outcomes for ourselves than what is common and default that we see all around us. These alarming rates of chronic disease that are only getting worse as innovation takes hold within our society and we all pick it up and use it in the blink of an eye. So that's a big picture perspective. Kudos for you for listening. You're doing right. We get comfortable in trying things relative within a state of ambiguity and uncertainty. There, a lot of things about health are not certain. And what I like to really, the first thing I said is try to live naturally. I think the heuristic of that, which is trying to take a lot of ideas or a big concept, just putting it into something that directs your action in the face of thousands of different environmental interactions. And if you use that heuristic to say, okay, well, what would living naturally look more like if I'm an office worker? Well, I'd probably get out, I'd get a little more sunshine. I'd eat the apple over the cupcake, right? And it directs you in many different ways. And it's hard to then fully process all the learning that we've ultimately taken over time, unless you sort of filter it into these simple rules that you can follow that help you do better. So that's a big, that's sort of my overarching perspective on why learning is important, but then how you have to turn that into personal skill to really get the benefits from that knowledge that you've now learned. Yeah. Cool. So another interesting thing too about knowledge is that I say that I have sort of a saying in terms of what comes to knowledge. So the first benefit of knowledge is familiarity. A few years ago, a lot of people were not really familiar with the benefits of fasting, and now they're familiar with it. But we want to move to fluency. So fluency means I know it well enough to direct my own actions. And eventually you want to move to mastery, which means that you know it well enough to direct your actions, but you also have then developed the skills in place to make it happen. So think about that for all these different subjects that matter. And the nice thing is, as I've sat back and thought about this, is that it's actually achievable, but it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a month or a week. Just ask yourself this question: will I be better in a year? Will I be more knowledgeable at taking care of myself? Will I learn things in the right way? And will I put the effort into developing real skill so that in 1 year from now, I'm better at least some of these things that matter than I was today? And if you maintain that mindset of just, am I almost doing the slow learning movement versus like trying to do it all at once, then I think you sort of make faster progress by going slower in a way. So keep that in mind. The other aspect about knowledge, which is so cool, is that it can serve as a better compass for the directionality of our efforts. Yeah. And as we were saying earlier, we do have to upgrade our playbook in the face of new information. And so as that new information comes in, can you use it to then say, all right, I'm going to do a slight little course correction here and keep things going in the most propitious direction I possibly can envision at this time, even in that sort of face of ambiguity. And I think understanding mechanisms, at least generally speaking, I mean, there are different people that are going to understand them to a much different degree, and that's great. Can you understand it enough to say, okay, this is actually pulling a lot of important concepts together, and it's giving me that deeper understanding to know which direction I should go in. So, going back to sleep and kind of giving something more specific here, my podcast is the official podcast of the Sleep Research Society and the Canadian Sleep Society. So with humanOS, humanOS Radio, I've been able to interview a lot of really smart people that are in this field. And one of the last people that I've interviewed on the subject, as you mentioned, is Lior Applebaum. And he's looking at sleep-wake patterns in zebrafish to then assess the relationship between the damage that occurs during wakefulness and simply just being awake and alive. Yeah. And then the recovery that takes place at night when we sleep, if indeed we are diurnal animals. I mean, different animals will manifest increased DNA repair during their sleep period, even if that occurs during the day. Probably. I mean, that's not been necessarily validated across many different models, but that's probably what's going on. And not only is that interesting for sleep, but it's actually reflective of how our health works generally. And so I'll come back to sleep in a moment, but we also mentioned sunshine. Sunshine, the UV rays of sun are a stressor. they can cause DNA damage. They can cause photoaging, burning, cataracts. But we also know, and that message has risen above all other aspects of what sunshine can do for our health. And at face value, I think a lot of people feel like, gosh, getting some sun feels good. And screw those recommendations. It doesn't feel natural from an intuitive perspective to avoid all the sun. We evolved on this planet where we were outside every day. But the way that we live now, and you'd mentioned this, we have this sort of weird binge purge relationship with the sun. We don't get a lot of it, and then we get too much. And just like you said, with exercise, you want to do this progressive overload. You can easily take something that is healthy for you, like exercise, and way overdo it and make it unhealthy for the body, crippling yourself for 10 days because you've way overdone it. And a lot of people have that sort of relationship with exercise. Similarly, you can do that with sunshine. And in fact, is sun necessarily pathological? Is it really bad for us? Or is the relationship that we have with it the problem? Because it's not this very natural pattern. So do I think avoiding the sun altogether is the right thing? No. But do I think getting an appropriate amount, given my recent exposure and possibly even my genetics, very possibly my genetics. If I have very fair skin, I might not be able to tolerate the sun much at all. But getting a little bit regularly is the goal, at least until we can easily tolerate more. And then, then the upward limit, who knows? I mean, we still know that natural living communities do just fine, and they don't have exploding rates of skin cancer. But then it's not our exposure pattern to sun is not the only thing that matters. Everything else matters too. How are we sleeping? What are we eating? And you then now have to take into consideration everything else about the way that we're living. And so it's cool to study these individual subjects one by one and see what we can learn from them. But ultimately, hyperspecialization around our physiology or these different subjects is a problem unto itself.
Yeah.
Because what we really care about is the healthful functioning of the body, how to make it perform well. And that it requires all of these various inputs in the right amount and their interactions with one another, right? So yes, sunshine has interesting stimulating effects to the body. We can go into detail there, like the reduction in atherosclerotic plaques in mice, as Scott Burns showed, alterations that lead to greater glucose control, possibly enhanced brown fat. He didn't show that, but other work has. Reductions in subcutaneous body fat. There's all these different other factors that sunlight is promoting. And instead of saying, let's just not get any and try to block out the negative effects, we need to take in the totality of those effects and then think, how do we give people good guidance so that they can have a healthy relationship with sunshine? Because once you have a healthy relationship with sunshine, that in itself is going to promote deeper, better sleep. Then that is going to promote deeper sleep, is going to promote better control over appetite and also potentially better food choice. Better food choice is going to help us deal with DNA damaging effects of sunlight and exercise better, And so again, living naturally is really a way to prevent the accumulation of biological damage that occurs with aging that then leads to that premature loss of function and life. And so, yeah, I'm super excited about the biotechnology of aging. I'll kind of believe it when I see it. And yet I'm super optimistic that it's possible, but I'm also not waiting. I'm sort of pretending as like that will not happen in my lifetime so that I don't have any sort of release valve that makes me not want to take care of my body as well as I possibly can today.
I get you. Just one thing that pops into my mind when you talk about the heuristic of, living as naturally as possible. I think for individuals like myself and yourself, that heuristic is quite good because we can still remember a world before the internet and cell phones. But like when you think about the millennials, like normal to them now, although it is not natural, but they might confuse normal and natural because they're like, well, like all my life I've been living in lighted, heated homes and there's always been artificial light around and I've always had a cell phone. And do you know what I mean? So like to them, like they might start confusing what's normal and natural. Because like yourself, like how many times have you had to explain the detrimental effects of artificial light to people who just haven't a clue. Like
Yeah.
people walk into my apartment and they always, it's the same thing. They hit the switch and nothing comes on, and I go, "Oh, do you need a light bulb?" It's like, "No, I don't have light bulbs." And then it's like, "What?" I was like, "Well, how do you see it at night?" I was like, "I use candles." And then they go, "Why?" And it's like, "Okay, here we go again."
Yeah.
Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? So
Oh, yeah.
it's kind of like, again, it just comes back to education, knowledge. But I suppose the question I want to pose to you here at this moment, if it's an area you'd like to discuss, is with the biotechnology going forward. And I fully appreciate your point there that you're not going to wait and rely on it, the same as myself. Like, but do you see a future where we can't, because we're not gonna get rid of technology. We're not putting that tool back in the toolbox. It's out now. So, and we don't want to go back and live in the cave. We're not saying that either. But we need to marry now our modern technology in a way that it's beneficial to promoting human health. So do you see going forward, or do you predict, and if you don't predict, would you like to see, and that's kind of a stupid question because I imagine you would, but like in my mind, I'm like, why aren't people like talking about human-centric lighting? Like, why can't we bring the sun inside to help offput some of this detrimental impact? Stuff like that. Like, buildings are just basically, you not build indoor buildings to be like the outdoor, so that it is more quote unquote natural, if you get what I mean. So I suppose the question
Yeah.
I'm posing to you is like if someone said to you, right, Dan, you're coming to this meeting where you're meeting with all the civil engineers, and we have to redo the environment of the world because we know that the environment people are living in right now is just not conducive to long-term health. So we're going to have to do things here in terms of people's exposures to light, the regulation of their meals, circadian biology, the whole works. So what would you think in terms of just kind of reinventing or upgrading the modern environment to kind of be more cohesive to the goal of health and longevity?
Yeah. I think, well, if I were in charge of the big budget, so I don't even know what that big budget is, but like I just had control over how money was spent, I would first take the money that we're dedicating towards symptom management, and I would move it into the aging field to address the underlying biology that leads to those symptoms. So a huge fraction of that disease management spending would then, which is where that money lies now, would move to aging mechanisms. And I think we would make faster and better progress there. Where do we see that benefit will come from? I don't know. There's 120 different biotech companies at the moment that are focused on aging and different aspects of it. And that's super exciting to me.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about it, and I want to do my best to stay current with what's happening there, because we're learning also a lot about physiology in general, just by approaching and focusing on our research dollars in that way. And then, so if we were to pair much more aggressive funding in age mitigation therapy, that's our sick care system. And then some of that funding, of course, would still go to treating or dealing with people in a palliative fashion with surgery, drugs, and diagnostics that we have now with our sick care system. But a lot more of that spending would go towards the underlying biology mechanisms. And then we would do a lot more around education of our society
Yeah.
and environmental design. So we would change schooling. 50% of schooling would actually be learning how to live successfully in a technologically demanding, driven world. And that, you can ask the question, inadequacy of skill in what subject? History, art, math, all subjects that are important, but which one leads to the loss of life in years, or the reduction in the capacity to live into your full potential, to achieve your goals, whatever they might be as you grow up, right? None of those are more important than understanding how to take care of the body within today's world. So, and we don't even know what tomorrow is going to look like. So we can't just have a class on nutrition in college and then call it quits. I mean, this has to be the training of skilled individuals in an age appropriate fashion from kindergarten all the way up to when they're now in life. And then in modern life, every corporation needs to have a much more aggressive self-care system, a culture that supports it, tools that enable it, And now you're really addressing the population from its development all the way into the workplace, and we do much better then. And then you pair that with really top, forward thinking sick care, and now you have a chance to actually have a population live much healthier. And even if that means that we're not extending, we would actually see an increase in average lifespan, because we would be reducing the amount of premature mortality that is decreased. But even if we were not having people living longer than, let's say, 100 years old, having people that are still in their 80s that are contributing to society and capable of doing so, both from a physical perspective to traverse the world and a mental perspective to think clearly, that's awesome. And, I'm going to quote one idea from my podcast with John Newman, professor at UCSF, geriatrician, and also a professor at the Buck Institute of Aging, who is looking at a variety of things. So he's involved in a variety of projects, but one of them is looking at ketones. And what he's shown and what he discussed is that in one study, they found that mice that were put on a ketogenic diet periodically starting midlife not only didn't show a age-related loss of memory, as most organisms do, right? Your memory is good up to a certain point and then it starts to decline. They showed essentially an improvement of memory across the entire lifespan. That's remarkable. So imagine you having a brain that was able to accumulate knowledge across your life history, so that you were truly able to capitalize on that wisdom that you've gained in over that 100-year period. I mean, that would be an amazing. So really cool, potential. The more natural that we live through the self-training and modification to modern work culture, the less damage we accumulate as individuals and individuals in society. And then the more we delay the need for the medications that are really only needed when we start to get sick. Now, yeah, there could be some crossover where we find that something is just frankly healthy, but let's look at metformin as an example. Metformin is a drug. It's the 4th prescribed drug in the United States. Was prescribed, I think, 80 million times in 2016. We have a long history of using it. It's a diabetic drug, and it's gotten a lot of popularity in terms of its looking at its effects in just for aging, so not for diabetes specifically. We're not entirely sure about how it's working. It's working in multiple different ways, so it's probably not just one mechanism. But there's been, through people that are really interested in capitalizing on our latest knowledge, the aggressive is like, all right, I've got mid 50-year-old men that are starting to take it and are wanting to, and they're healthy and they're fit. And I've been warning against that population to not be utilizing these sorts of drugs yet. And now a couple of studies have come out. I interviewed Ben Miller. Ben Miller talked about his work looking at cardiorespiratory fitness, which is the #1 marker for longevity. So it's the highest correlation with longevity. So if your cardiorespiratory fitness is low, your early mortality is high, and vice versa. And basically, if you give metformin and you put somebody on a training protocol for cardiorespiratory fitness, it obliterates a lot of the fitness gains that they get from training. And we've seen that before with like antioxidants and physical activity, et cetera. So whenever we're trying to intervene in our physiology directly, we're really running into risks. And then another study came out recently that showed the hypothesis was there's variability in terms of the benefits people get from a strength training program when they're older. Could some of that difference be from higher levels of inflammation in the body? And if you took metformin, could you actually have better outcomes in response to a strength training program? And what they found is exactly the opposite, that the placebo group that did the strength training had all the expected gains that you would hope for. And the addition of 1,700 milligrams per day, or 1,700, 1.7 grams of metformin per day obliterated those benefits. and prevented all of that effort from translating into improvements in health. And so it's just a good forewarning that, listen, whenever we're trying to intervene in our physiology in that way, you really are running the risks, running some risks. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't be beneficial for some populations at some points. We have more work to do. It could be a dosing schedule. It could be dosing amounts. It could be right for just, certain populations. But I'd say double down on the lifestyle behaviors and then use caution for the things that are sort of the drugifying health. Like a lot of times when we see a drug that's beneficial in health, it's usually because it's showing it in a disease condition. It doesn't show that it's in a healthy condition and preventing necessarily disease. So we just need to take a big dose of humility here and focus, double down on the things that we know matter. And that's going to give you time for research to occur and for us to learn more about where our true opportunities lie in terms of, the biopharmaceutical route and improving human health.
Big time. I know we've only about 5 minutes left here, and just one area I really did want to get your thoughts on was this area of peripheral circadian regulators, and I just want to get your thoughts on meal timing, and what are your thoughts around it now? Because obviously with the work of like Sash and Panda, and I previously spoke with Greg Potter about this, and there's a few others out there now speaking about the importance of meal timing as a fairly important circadian regulator. Now, albeit a peripheral one, it doesn't seem to be in the same category as the central regulating clock of the body, the suprachiasmatic nucleus with light and dark, but it still is a very important regulator in terms of these peripheral circadian clocks. And in terms of our health, in terms of like what time of day we're more metabolically wired to actually ingest our food. So just from a perspective of health and longevity, what are your thoughts? And I don't mean to be so narrow down one area, but I just suppose it's a topic I just wanted to hear your thoughts on too.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad you had Greg on the show. He's a real world-class expert on the subject, and that was his PhD was in that, and he has real mastery and deep knowledge on it. What I would say caution and add to the discussion is that now a early time restricted feeding window, so eating breakfast and lunch and skipping dinner, it seems to be the better method of doing some daily fasting. And so in this conversation of fasting, which is how many hours in a day are you not taking in food, or do you have days in a week where you're having fewer calories, or weeks in a month or quarter where you're actually restricting your calories considerably? A lot of different strategies can be employed. They may or may not offer different benefits. We haven't really done a comparison where you would, let's say, do a shortened eating window compared to 1 week protein, fasting mimicking diet every quarter over a 3-4 year period with, that those types of studies need to be conducted. We should probably aim to see what's efficacious, what's the easiest thing to do. But I want to make the point that something called this interventional impact needs to be considered. So let's say you get better benefit with having breakfast and lunch than you do with having lunch and dinner. Does lunch and dinner still offer benefits? If yes, then we need to look at how easy it is for an average person to be able to do one or the other protocol. So if lunch and dinner ends up being 50 times more likely that an average person can do that, then we should double down, not on necessarily what's most efficacious, but what's more likely that people are going to benefit from that. And of course, I think the research should continue along both lines, but you have to match human behavior with the physiology, and then sometimes arrive at a place where you say, this is my recommendation is this. And this might be a little bit different from what the study says is ideal, but we know that many more humans, what I call breakfast is an independent act and dinner is the social event. It's difficult, of our life these days. I mean, sometimes lunch, but dinner is with family. dinners with, going out to dinner with friends. So perhaps the better thing to focus on is just trying to have dinner early. But giving it up altogether is really hard, and not that many people are going to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my thinking around time restricted feeding. And I didn't quite answer your question directly, but I do.
No, it's so funny because it's very similar to my current thoughts on it too. That okay, just from the current literature, it does seem to be more beneficial to take in the majority of your calories in a restricted feeding window. That's earlier in a restricted feeding window. The way I said that's earlier in the day versus in later in the day, but when we're looking at this whole scope of what we call quote unquote health and wellness, and the conversation of what is health and wellness is a whole other 10 other podcasts in terms of like what is it and how would you measure it and how would you even go about that. But if we're just looking at a more 30,000 view, like as you just alluded to there, okay, but then with dinner in the evening, there's that whole social aspect, there's the whole family aspect, there's the ritual of having a dinner and sharing food, and is the benefits of whatever is being released in your body from a chemical level when you're around loved ones, is the benefit of that going to outweigh having a meal 2, 3, 4 hours in a different feeding window? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
so it's another sort of aspect we need to consider. And as you kind of alluded to earlier, and I fully agree, I mean, and I think anyone listening agrees, this idea of looking at these one aspects of what can contribute to health and longevity, in just like one specific area, really isn't going to get us anywhere. We do need to step back and to take a look at how everything is combining, and always look at all these things in the context of a specific situation with a particular individual at a particular moment in time. So like nothing's in isolation.
It's I imagine that physiology could just as easily adjust to the 2 meals a day of breakfast and lunch. But we also know that being around that it could, from lunch to dinner, you could adjust your physiology and probably arrive at a place where it's easy for you to continue with that if you trained yourself over a period of, let's say, weeks, to get to that place and be comfortable, have the metabolic flexibility to be comfortable with that pattern. But we also know that being in front of food is in itself a stimulator of appetite. The smells, even just watching somebody cook or eat will trigger the cephalic phase of, your body is now preparing to eat, and then that makes it harder. It induces hunger, and you want to eat. So how many dinners might you say no to that are social if you're doing this sort of feeding pattern of breakfast and lunch only? And what do you, and just, just saying what we've been talking about, what do you lose by doing that? Right? What do you lose by the 3-hour dinner with family and the conversation about life and friendship and all of it? What do you lose there? And that you don't see that in a clinical trial per se, but you need to factor it in.
Definitely. Listen, we could talk for hours, but we're up here on time. So listen, I appreciate you. I appreciate the work you're doing. I appreciate what you're trying to contribute to the world and society. I can't say that word. Society at large. So Dan, you're an absolute legend. Where can people find out more about you and what you got going on?
Well, likewise, Robbie, thank you for all your contributions. Thanks for having me on. I'd say go to humanos.me. There, we're at Twitter at humanos_me. Our podcast, which you can see every time we put up a podcast, we have a blog about it. That's at blog at humanos.me. But even if you sign up for our basic account, which is free on humanOS, you get our weekly newsletter. There we feature, all our podcasts and new products and other podcasts that we like. And so I'd say come check it out. Try it for a month, see if you like it. And then our pro plan, we create a bunch of different guides, how-to guides. How do you design your lighting environment in your home and work? How do you do the paleo diet correctly under sort of from our perspective? And then we have all these peer-reviewed health courses, and the courses are short, 20 to 30 minutes. They're peer-reviewed by professors. It doesn't guarantee that everything in there is right or will not change, but it's a level of validation and credibility that we love to sort of take that extra effort to do. And so, see if humanOS, I think of humanOS as itself a health skill. It is an amplifier of effort. and it is a directional compass that you can then, be better in a year. So that's our effort. Check it out. And, we'd love to have you in our community.
Absolutely. And everything that Dan mentioned will be in the show notes. And just so the listeners know, Dan's podcast lately, along with Dan Harris's 10% Happier and Peter Tia's Drive, they've been my new ones lately. I've been really getting into some fantastic stuff. But as I was saying to you before we hopped online, your podcast is just, I think it's a hidden gem, because they're just like, they're not long. They're, usually anywhere from 25 to 45 minutes, and they're just like, boom, gems. So again, I really appreciate all the info you're putting out.
I appreciate that. The podcasts are, they take time, because we prepare a lot for a short conversation, but I get so much out of it, and it's fun to be able to share that conversation with people. So yeah, check them out.
Absolutely. Dan, I'll say a quick goodbye to you offline, but for all the listeners right now, I appreciate your earbuds. Share this around, particularly to anyone you think could really benefit from the information. And as I said, I'll link up everything that Dan mentioned in the show notes, so make sure you go over and check out humanOS. So until next time, guys, peace.